there, welcome to Everyday Moodlings. I'm your host, Jeree Parks, and this week we're going to work with colored pencils. So, I really love all the color mediums that are out there, and every time I use a different one, that becomes my favorite for a while, and then I'll move back and forth. About the only thing that I don't own, believe it or not, is a set of Copics. Just never added that to my arsenal. But I'm a big believer in using your color mediums and knowing how to use your color mediums, because oftentimes we feel like we're failing simply because we don't know the proper methods for using them. So I'm going to show you a specific technique used with colored pencils called burnishing, and that's what I did on my image here, on the hair, on the eyes, and on her lips. One of the wonderful things about colored pencils is, one, they're dry. They're always dry. You're not using them wet. So that's, to me, is a nice break from messing around with paint and watercolor paints and markers and mediums and you know, crayons and gelatos and whatnot. It's just nice sometimes to work with a dry medium. So the other nice thing about them is you can put them down over black, and while I can still see the black here, it does kind of obscure it so it's more in the background, and I like that look. So I'm going to show you how to do that, how to create a burnished look on your stamped images. I also wanted to point out this piece in the background here. This is called an acrylic skin, and we will be working on those in the next video, but wanted to add it. It just fit perfectly for this particular page, so I wanted to point that out. If you are on YouTube, there'll be a link to the blog post for this one, and you'll see step-by-step instructions for completing this art journaling page as well. So what do you need to burnish, and what is burnishing? Well, burnishing basically means you're going to flatten out the ridges of the paper that your image is on. So you're going to need obviously some colored pencils, and I have several different colors here to match up with my image. You're also going to need some watercolor paper. You need cold pressed watercolor paper. You need it to be rough. If it's flat, there's really nothing to burnish. And if it's flat or heat pressed watercolor paper, it's not going to hold on to the color as well from your watercolor, or I'm sorry, from your colored pencils. You need the ridges. And I'm sorry about my blue fingernails. You can always tell when I spend some time in the studio, and that's usually when I make these videos, because my fingernails are usually not in a good shape. So the last thing you need to have is something to burnish the image with, and that I typically use a colorless blender. This is by Prismacolor, and it works really well with Prismacolor pencils. Doesn't work quite as well with other brands. So I love Prismacolor. I think it's a great brand of colored pencils, but you can also use Derwent. That's another brand that I really like. Both are kind of mid-range brands. Obviously you can get much more expensive, but I think that's kind of silly when you can get a mid-range brand and it'll work just fine for you. So I've stamped a butterfly and a heart on my watercolor paper, and this is nothing fancy. This is just a little block of paper. I'm trying to find a brand on here for you. Nothing really, you know, again, kind of mid-range watercolor paper, nothing super fancy, but it does need to be rough. It needs to be the cold press. So we're going to start with our butterfly, and we're going to be using an orange, a yellow, and a blue. The first thing we're going to do when you burnish is obviously put down your layers of color, but we're going to put down multiple layers. So I'm going to start with the whole thing with yellow, and then I'm going to layer some blue along the edges. And you're going to see me repeat that. In the center, I'll probably only put down one coat, because that's just going to be this orangey yellow color. So we're going to start with that. Now, in the body, I'm kind of choosing not to cover up too much of the black, although I could cover up all of the black if I wanted to. And I'm just going to real quickly put on a couple of coats here. And then we're going to move over to the yellow, and I'm going to fill in all of the wings with the yellow. Even though I'm going to be putting blue on top of the outer edges, I'm going to choose to put yellow over the entire wing, including the black portions of it. Now, I'm not worrying too much about going outside the lines on this one. I'm not being super careful. This is an image I would cut out if I was using anyway, and I'm really bad at coloring in the lines anyway, so I stamped the image using Versamark. It's a good, or VersaFine, I'm sorry, VersaFine ink. It's a good waterproof ink once it dries, so it's going to stay where I want it. You can also use StazOn. I would be a little concerned about using it just a straight up dye ink that's not waterproof. You might get some smearing with it as you really start to work this color. Now, it might be a little hard to tell because I used yellow, which doesn't have a huge contrast to this background, but you should be able to see some spots where there is no color. Burnishing allows you to fill in all of that space. So now I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add some blue, and it's going to blend a little bit with the yellow. To the base of this wing and then the side of this. That's the first coat. Now we're going to go back and I'm going to put an entire second coat over it again. You can do up to 3 coats if you want to, but I typically do 2. And I'm going to go over the whole thing again with yellow and then add in more of that blue on top. Okay, so we have our image entirely colored at this point. Now we're going to go back and we're going to press really, really firmly with our colorless blender in order to move that color around and flatten out our surface. One of the reasons I like using the colorless blender is also it's a wax-based product, so it adds a bit of shine to the image as well. It's also very hard, so you're not going to break the tip, because you're going to be pushing pretty hard to kind of flatten out any ridges in your image. Now you will transfer a little bit of color, so before I move on, I am going to go ahead and clean it off. Second of all, as you're doing this, you'll notice some of the color may fleck away. Now you can kind of brush it away, but I'm always afraid that I might transfer color where I don't want it. So you may see me pick it up the image and blow off any color dust that I don't want. Now I'm going to be working around the edges and pulling it into that yellow rather than working it backwards or outward. stop there for a second so you can see the difference between this one and this one. You kind of lose almost all of those, and I can go back and do a little bit more of those spaces where you see white still, or the ivory background. You can continue to work it until you get what you're going for. And I could go back and add more color if I needed it as well. But I like the way it gently blends in when I get done there and gives just a little bit of sheen to it because of the wax. Now you can also use a white colored pencil to do the burnishing, but of course that'll change the color a little bit of your project. These colorless blenders are really inexpensive and I highly recommend. Done. Now if I wanted to keep the two colors more distinct, I would not layer them together, creating more of a green than the blue. So, but that was, I was looking for that particular blending effect. So you have the blue and the yellow come together to create this beautiful green along the edges. So that's the basics of how you burnish. We'll go ahead, I'll go ahead and do one more real quick. This is heart. In this one, I'm not going to try as hard to cover up the black. I'm going to let the black be a little bit more. So we have the heart done, and this time I didn't use such contrasting colors. So my colors, my two kind of pinkish colors are really close, similar in shade, so it just seems a little darker on the bottom, and I added some white to the very top to kind of give it a nice gradiated look. So that's the basics of how you burnish using colored pencils. You just want to remember some basic things. One, you want to use a rough textured paper like cold pressed watercolor paper. You want to put multiple layers of color down, and then you need to burnish it with something that's really hard so that you can press down that texture and really move that color around. So if you have any questions about how to do this, please be sure to let me know. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, there'll be a link to the blog for pictures and to see some finished projects with this particular technique. I'm your host with Everyday Moodlings, and I will see you next time where we talk about acrylic skins.